4 hours. That's the time it takes for the ocean to freeze and the human heart to stop. Today, we open a sealed chest of history. This is the diary of Dr. Arthur Stewart, the man who saw 129 souls and two of Britain's greatest ships, the Erebus and the Terror, turn to icy dust. Prepare for the longest winter of your life. Subscribe and leave a comment northwest if you're ready to know the truth. Let's begin. May 19th, 1845, Greenheath, England. The Thames was a forest of masts, but the Erebus and the Terror stood above them all like titans. I remember the smell of fresh paint and the warmth of the spring sun on my neck. We were the pride of the Royal Navy, 129 of the finest men, handpicked to find the legendary Northwest Passage. Dr. Stewart, Sir John Franklin said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder, "We aren't just sailing for trade. We are sailing to finish the map of the world. We have steam engines, enough canned beef to feed an army, and the blessing of the Queen. What could possibly stop us?" I smiled back, but as I looked at the massive iron plates being bolted to the bow to crush the ice, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. It wasn't the wind, it was the feeling that we were building a cage, not a ship. By July, the green hills of England were a memory. We were in the Davis Strait, surrounded by icebergs that looked like floating cathedrals. The light here is different. It's thin, silver, and hungry. Our evenings were filled with the sound of a hand cranked organ playing Home, Sweet Home. The men laughed, played cards, and talked about the riches waiting for us in the Pacific. But in my infirmary, the atmosphere was different. I began to examine the men who complained of fatigue. Young, strong sailors were losing their strength. Their gums were pale, their tempers short. I checked the canned food. The tin linings were sloppy, the lead solder leaking into the broth. I wrote in my secret journal, "The poison is already inside the walls. We are carrying our end with us, sealed in tin." September 1845, Beechy Island. The ice closed in like a closing fist. Within a week, the sea was solid stone. We prepared for the dark months. We covered the decks with canvas to create a winter roof. The silence was the worst part. At night, you could hear the ice grinding against the hull, a sound like teeth gnashing on bone. I performed my first burial on that frozen shore, young John Torrington. He was only 20. As we lowered him into the permafrost, the wind whipped the prayers out of the captain's mouth. I looked at the graves of the three men we lost that first winter. They were the lucky ones. They died while we still had hope. They died while we still believed the ice would melt in the spring. We didn't know then that the sun was a stranger and the iron silence was our only true companion. September 12, 1846, the day the world stopped. We were navigating the Victoria Strait just off the coast of King William Island when a shift in the wind pushed a massive wall of multi-year ice against us. It wasn't the soft, slushy ice of summer. It was blue, ancient, and harder than granite. The Terror and the Erebus were pinned. At first, we laughed. Another winter's rest, the men joked. We prepared the lanterns and the libraries. But as the months passed, the laughter turned into something brittle. The ice didn't just hold us, it began to squeeze. Every night, the sound of the hull buckling under pressure echoed through the lower decks like a heartbeat of a dying giant. I sat in my cabin, watching the frost crawl across my medicine chest. I realized then that we weren't just stuck, we were being slowly digested by the North. By the winter of 1847, the sickness had become our most frequent visitor. It wasn't the scurvy we had been trained to fear, it was something more insidious. I watched Lieutenant Gore, once the most vibrant man on the ship, stare at a wall for 4 hours, unable to remember his own mother's name. Men began to argue over nothing. Their joints throbbed with a dull metallic pain. I spent my nights testing the canned soup we ate every day. Lead. The tins were sealed with thick, sloppy solder. The very food meant to save us was poisoning our blood, turning our thoughts into sludge. We were becoming ghosts before we were even dead. I tried to warn Captain Franklin, but his eyes were clouded by a strange, stubborn fog. The Navy does not make mistakes, Doctor, he told me, but the Navy wasn't here. Only the lead and the ice were. June 11th, 1847. Sir John Franklin is dead. He didn't die in battle or from a sudden accident. He simply faded away in his cabin, surrounded by maps of a passage he would never find. We buried him in the ice, but we couldn't even dig a proper grave. The ground was as hard as iron. Command fell to Captain Crozier of the Terror. Crozier was a different man, a man of shadows and silence. He looked at the charts, then at the ice, and then at the 128 of us left. He knew the summer of 47 never came. July passed, and the ice didn't move an inch. The temperature never rose above freezing. For the first time, I saw men weeping openly on deck, not because of pain, but because of the terrifying realization that the earth had forgotten us. The sun was a pale, heatless ghost, and we were trapped in a white tomb that stretched for 1,000 miles in every direction. April 22nd, 1848, 19 months in the ice. The Erebus was being crushed. The water was rising in the hold, and the coal for the engines was gone. We had lived in the dark for so long that the men had forgotten the color of grass. Captain Crozier called me to his cabin. Doctor, he said, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. We leave the ships tomorrow. We walk. Walk where, Captain? It's 200 miles to the mainland, and then 800 more to the nearest outpost. We walk south, he replied. We tried the boats on sledges. It is better to die moving toward home than to rot here in the silence. That night, I packed my journals. I looked at the library, the thousands of books, the silver plate, the fine china. We were going to try to carry civilization across a desert of ice. I knew then that we were mad, but madness was the only thing that kept us from lying down in the snow and letting the iron silence take us. April 22nd, 1848. We stepped off the wooden decks for the last time. I remember the sound of the wind howling through the frozen rigging of the Erebus. It sounded like a widow's wail. We left the ships standing like two black teeth in the white jaw of the Arctic. We were 105 men. We weren't just walking, we were beasts of burden. We had mounted the heavy whaleboats on massive iron shod oak sledges. Each sledge weighed nearly 3,000 pounds. We were pulling our own coffins across the jagged frozen pressure ridges of King William Island. Pull, you devils. Crozier's voice cracked in the frost. Each mile south is a mile closer to a tree, to a fire, to a life. But as I looked at the men harnessed to the ropes, I saw only skeletons draped in blue navy wool. Their teeth were loose in their sockets, and their legs were swollen with the black bruises of scurvy. It was a madness born of pride. As the days bled into weeks, I watched the men discard the very things they thought made them civilized. At first, we carried everything: silver forks, heavy mahogany writing desks, volumes of Shakespeare, and even a lightning conductor. But the Arctic doesn't care for silver. One by one, these treasures were left in the snow. I saw a sailor drop a heavy silk curtain he had carried for 5 miles. He didn't even look back. He just kept his head down, eyes fixed on the heels of the man in front of him. By the 10th mile, the trail was littered with the debris of the British Empire. We were being stripped bare, reduced to nothing but the instinct to put one foot in front of the other. The first man died on the third day of the march. He didn't scream or collapse in agony. He simply stopped pulling, sat down in the snow, and closed his eyes. "Get up, lad," Miller, the boatswain, shouted, shaking him. But the sailor was already gone. The cold had reached his heart the moment he stopped moving. We couldn't bury him. The ground was permafrost, stone disguised as earth. We piled a few rocks over his body and kept moving. By the end of the first week, we were leaving a trail of small stone mounds. The Great March had become a funeral procession. I walked at the back, the keeper of the iron silence, recording the names in a notebook that was becoming too heavy for my trembling hands. We reached the southern coast of the island. Across the frozen strait lay the mainland of North America, but the ice here was a chaotic jumble of shards tilted at impossible angles. It took us 5 days to move 3 miles. The rations were failing. The lead in our blood was making us paranoid. I saw men whispering in corners of the tents, their eyes bright with a feverish, dark light. They weren't talking about home anymore. They were looking at each other's throats. Doctor, Captain Crozier whispered to me one night, his face gaunt in the flickering light of a blubber lamp. If we reach the Great Fish River and there is no game, if there are no deer, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I had ever felt. We were no longer an expedition of the Royal Navy. We were a tribe of starving animals, lost in a world that had never known the name of God. By the autumn of 1848, we were no longer 105. We were a fragmented line of shadows. The discipline of the Royal Navy, which had held us together for 3 years, finally shattered like frozen glass. Captain Crozier and a small group decided to push south toward the Great Fish River, but others had lost the strength to hope. A group of 20 men, led by a young lieutenant whose mind had been hollowed out by the lead, decided to turn back. They believed the ships were still there, waiting with warm coal and hidden tins of meat. I stood at the crossroads of the ice and watched them walk away. They didn't have the strength to pull the sledges anymore. They just walked, empty handed, into the white haze. I knew I would never see them again. I stayed with Crozier, not because I believed in the river, but because I wanted to be there to record the end. We reached a place that later explorers would call Starvation Cove. We had one boat left. We were so weak that we could no longer pull it. We sat inside it, sheltered from the wind by its wooden ribs, and waited for the snow to cover us. I looked at my hands. They were black with frostbite, the skin peeling away to reveal the white bone beneath. I opened my journal one last time. October 14th, 1848. The wind has stopped, but the cold is louder than ever. We are surrounded by silver forks and silk pajamas, lying in the mud of a land that does not want us. If anyone finds this, tell England that we did not fail because we were weak. We failed because we were human, and the North is not. I watched Miller close his eyes, then the lieutenant, finally the captain. I was the last one awake. I felt the iron silence finally entering my chest, heavy and cold. I wasn't afraid. I was just tired. I leaned back against the frozen wood of the boat and watched the stars. They were so bright, so indifferent. For over a century and a half, the Arctic kept our secret. Generations of searchers came looking for us. They found our graves, our discarded silver, and the skeletal remains of our death march bee. They heard stories from the Inuit about white men who fell down and died as they walked. But the ships, the Erebus and the Terror, remained hidden. They became ghosts, legends that lived only in the oral histories of the local tribes. The world moved on. Empires fell. Men flew to the moon. And all the while, our ships sat in the darkness of the seabed, preserved by the freezing water. Then the silence was broken. In 2014, a remote operated vehicle descended into the murky waters of Queen Maud Gulf. The cameras flickered to life, and there she was, the Erebus. 2 years later, they found the Terror in Terror Bay, sitting perfectly upright on the floor of the ocean. When the divers entered the wrecks, they found a time capsule. Plates still sat on the tables. The captain's desk was still there. My medicine bottles were still lined up on the shelves, their labels preserved by the cold. The iron silence had finally spoken, but it didn't speak of glory or Northwest passages. It spoke of the terrible price of ambition. It spoke of 129 men who loved their families, who feared the dark, and who held on to each other until the very end. Why does the world still care about us? Why do you listeners sit here for 4 hours listening to the story of our failure? Perhaps it's because our story is your story. We are all on an expedition into the unknown. We all carry our lead and our ice. And in the end, we all face the same choice. Do we lie down in the snow, or do we keep walking toward a horizon we might never reach? The ships are no longer lost. They are home in the dark where they belong. And as for us, our names are etched in stone, and our breath is the wind that still howls over King William Island. The silence is no longer iron. It is a memory, and memories, like the ice, never truly melt. You have just listened to the full chronicle of Franklin's expedition, a dive into one of the greatest mysteries of our planet. This story is not about death, but about the limits of what a person can endure. If you have walked this path from the golden sailing in England to the last steps in Starvation Cove, you too have now become the guardians of this memory. Please subscribe to the channel to support the creation of such large scale stories and leave a final comment. The ice remembers. Thank you for being with us for these 4 hours. Until the next journey into the heart of history.